Hello and welcome to Make It Happen with Will Polston. I'm Will Polston. This is episode number 123, and in this episode I'm joined by a mentor, coach and all-round inspiration of mine, Dr. John Demartini. Dr. John Demartini is a world-renowned specialist in human behaviour, a researcher, author and global educator that's been solving personal and professional issues since 1973. His teachings start at the core of the issue, addressing the human factor, and range out to a multitude of powerful tools that have proven the test of time. He's studied over 30,000 books across all the defined academic disciplines and has synthesized the wisdom of the ages, which he shares on stage in over 100 countries. His presentations, whether keynotes, seminars, workshops, or podcast interviews like this, leave clients with insights into their behaviour and keys to their empowerment. Dr. Demartini has addressed public and professional audiences up to 11,000 people at a time across the world and shared stages with some of the world's most influential people, such as Sir Richard Branson, Stephen Covey, Steve Wozniak, Robert Kiyosaki, Wayne Dyer, Deepak Chopra, Donald Trump, and many more. In this episode, we're going to be discussing love and wisdom. So, Dr. Demartini, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to it.
Great to have you back. And as many of our listeners know, I'm an avid student. I've spent many years now studying and learning from you and learning your wisdoms and incorporating them into my life, and then sharing those ripple effects out with clients and how it's benefited them. And for today's conversation, what I was planning on doing is taking us to a few different areas. But one of the things that I always love to talk about when I have wonderful guests like yourself is the motive, the driver that enables people to be able to go and do what they do. And what few people know about you is the sort of the humble beginnings in terms of way back when, and the experience that you had that created the void that's giving you the value in the key work that you do now. So if we could maybe go back and let people know about how the life of sharing your love and wisdom with the world, literally with the world, came about.
The 1 minute, 2 minute, 5 minute.
Let's go with the 5 minute version. Yeah, let's go with the 5 minute.
5 minute version. All right. I had learning challenges as a child. I was born with a leg and arm turned in with a deformity, and I had a speech impediment. And when I was a year and a half, I had to go to specialist for both arm and leg and speech. I used to wear buttons and strings in my mouth. I was told in first grade by my first grade teacher in front of my parents, after failing learning how to read and write, that I'm afraid your son's never going to be able to read. He's never going to be able to write. He's not going to be able to communicate effectively, probably not go very far in life, probably won't amount to much. If I were you, I'd put him into sports. Because from a year and a half old to 4 years old, I had to wear braces on my arm and leg. And when I got out of them at 4, all I wanted to do is run. I want to be free. And I guess I became sports oriented more than academic oriented. I made it through school, elementary school, by the help of the smartest kids, by asking questions, which I'm known for today, is asking questions. So all those are actually perfect starting points, even though they didn't seem to be at the time. When I was 12, my parents moved from Houston, Texas, to Richmond, Texas, and I moved to a very low socioeconomic area. There weren't a lot of smart kids that I could ask questions to, and I started failing, and I dropped out of school. So at 13, I left home, became a street kid, and but I had picked up surfing at 9, but Texas wasn't the surf capital, so I needed to go to California and Hawaii to go surfing. So at 14, I decided I was going to hitchhike to California and go down to Mexico and surf. So I literally took my bag, my surfboard, and took off to California, hitchhiking there, and had some great adventures there, met amazing people. And literally in a matter of a few days, I met Ted Nugent, and had a party with Ted Nugent, met Howard Hughes, and I met Timothy Leary all in a few days, just hitchhiking to California. And that's a whole story in itself. And it was Howard Hughes that taught me to learn how to read and gain the wisdom of love and the love of wisdom, which is still my cufflinks today. They say love and wisdom. I made it eventually to Hawaii at 15. And I lived in under a bridge, and then on a park bench, and then in a bathroom, and an abandoned car, and then finally a tent. And I was surfing by big waves, and I did quite well there. I was in kind of a B group. There was a top 12 people. I was in the second group. But I got in some surf movies and surf books and surf magazines at the time and rode 40-foot waves. And I think I had a kind of a death wish, because you had to be able to do that at the time. And then I nearly died. And in the recovery of that, I ended up at a little health food store in a little yoga class, and I met Paul C. Bragg one night and he was a guest speaker at this little class. I never went to classes, but somebody told me to go there, and this changed my life. Paul C. Bragg, right? Mm-hmm. And 1 hour, this man, what he said touched my life. And after listening to him and his inspiring ideas, I thought maybe, just maybe, I might be able to overcome my learning problems and learn how to read and someday be intelligent. That was the first night in my entire life I thought maybe I could be intelligent. It was like a dream, but I just never thought it would be possible. It was so meaningful that night when I got to think that maybe I could. And so I ended up changing the trajectory of my life after meeting him and going and trying to learn how to read. And I picked up this first book in a health food store called Chico's Organic Gardening in You. The guy on the cover looked like me, and I thought, if that dude could write that book, I bet I could read it. And it was a bunch of pictures on gardens. So I just thought, okay, it's the first book I ever actually went page by page and looked at, even though I didn't read it all. And then I decided I was in meditation. I was going to go home, and I flew back to California and hitchhiked back to Texas to see my parents, because I hadn't seen them in a long time. And they encouraged me to take a GED, and I ended up taking this test. I figured I had nothing to lose. Closed my eyes, took a pencil, and just filled in a bunch of dots. I couldn't read half the questions, didn't understand all the words. But for some miraculous reason, I passed this friggin' test. And my parents said, why don't you try to go to college? And I couldn't go into regular college, but I could go to a junior college. And there I failed my first classes I tried to take. I got a 27. I needed a 72 to pass. And I almost gave up on my dream. And I was sitting there crying in a living room. And my mom saw me. She said, son, what happened to you? What's wrong? I said, Mom, I blew the test. I guess I'll never be able to read, never be able to write, never be able to communicate, never amount to things, never go very far in life. I repeated what she said to me because it was still in my head. My mom didn't know what to say. She just listened. And then she put her hand on my shoulder. She said, son, whether you become a great teacher and travel the world like you dream, whether you go back to Hawaii and ride giant waves like you've done, or go back to the streets and panhandle as a bum, which you've also done, just want to let you know that your father and I are going to love you no matter what you do. And when she said that, my hand went into a fist. I saw the vision the night I saw Paul Bragg. And I said to myself, I'm going to master this thing called reading and learning and studying. I'm going to master this thing called teaching. And I'm going to do whatever it takes. I'm going to travel whatever distance. I'm going to pay whatever price to give my service of love across this planet. And I'm not going to let any friggin' human being on this planet stop me, not even myself. And I got up, I hugged my mom, I went into my room and I pulled out a dictionary and I started to memorize 30 words a day until my vocabulary was strong enough, with the help of my mom tested me every night, until my vocabulary was strong enough to pass school and then start to grow in school, because you put 30 words a day, that's a lot of words in a couple of years. And I started growing my vocabulary and I started excelling. And I had my first student start to ask me, can I teach him something? And my beginning of my career of teaching started. By the time I went to the University of Houston, I started having 100 to 150 people, 400 people sometimes a day asking questions under the trees each day when I would do my yoga and I just do these classes. My mom asked me what I want for my birthday. I said, I want the greatest teachings on the face of the earth, the greatest writings human beings have ever created around the world from the greatest minds. She had a brother who was a professor at MIT who sent 2 giant 6x6x6 foot wooden crates to my house on a flatbed truck filled with thousands of books by every imaginable discipline. And I just spent 18 to 20 hours a day. If I wasn't at school, I was there reading. and learning how to grow my vocabulary and reading dictionaries and encyclopedias and everything else, try to grow my knowledge to catch up with everybody else. And my teaching career just took off. When I went to professional school, I started teaching 7 days a week. And then when I graduated, I started teaching every night. And it grew from the city to across the nation to eventually internationally. And now, by the end of this year, it'll be 100 and almost 70 countries I've gotten to speak in now. So right now it's sitting at 163, but I've got a bunch of them coming up this year. So I had a dream to step foot in every country on the face of the earth, and I still got about 50 countries to go.
Amazing, absolutely amazing. And I think that the reason why I always love hearing that story is because in life, I believe that there's certain people that are inspirations for us, and those inspirations, as you've taught me, are people that are reflecting to us what we're not seeing in ourselves, or certainly not acknowledging in ourselves. And for you, sort of Paul Bragg has obviously been a big, as many other people have been those components in that, and have been the catalyst for you to go and do what you do. And that unconditional love that your mum and dad said, look, no matter what you choose to do, we're always going to love you. And I think so many of us grow up with, whether it be society or anything else, of a conditioning to want to prove that we're worthy of love for our parents, but then just being able to do what we do and know we're going to be loved anyway almost takes off the restrictions to go and pursue what is most inspiring to us. And
Exactly.
and it's powerful. And again, something that I've learned from you is that a lot of people they talk about, oh, I want to get motivated, I want to be motivated, and I want to get revved up every day and go and move forward. But you've got a very simple but effective model talking about the differences between inspiration and motivation, and the language that's used when you're operating from a place of motivation versus inspiration, and the perception ratios that you have, and even actually the parts of our brain that we're engaging, whether that be the amygdala right up to the prefrontal cortex. So for people that aren't aware of of the differences, but then if we could talk about being inspired and obviously living in our values for that, for people that aren't familiar about it, that'd be amazing.
Well, every human being, regardless of age or gender spectrum or culture, lives moment by moment by a set of priorities, a set of values that they're things that are most to least important in their life. And everybody's different. It's unique fingerprint like. My highest value is teaching and learning. My lowest value is maybe cooking and driving. And the thing that's highest on your value, you're spontaneously, intrinsically driven to do. There are things called spontaneous potentials in the brain and evoked potentials. Spontaneous potentials, even science doesn't know exactly how they come about, but they're just spontaneously, intrinsically there in the brain. And evoke can be traced to a stimulus from an extrinsic source. When you're doing something low in your values, you need to be motivated to do it. You need a reward to do it or a punishment not to do it to get you to do it. And to live in motivation is to not have the momentum building power of an intrinsic drive. And whatever's highest on your values, where the most intrinsic drive is, the thing that you spontaneously do. It's like a boy that loves his video games. He doesn't need to be motivated to do that. He might need motivated to do his homework, but not his games. Well, when an individual finds what that is, that one thing that's so inspiring to them, that is intrinsically driving them, that's where they're going to excel. And finding that out, that area, if they structure their life around that, prioritize their life according to that, delegating lower priority things from that, they're freed and liberated to build incremental momentum towards something profound. And that's a life of inspiration instead of a quiet life of desperation, as Thoreau would say, trying to be motivated and having to start and stop and start and stop and get motivated. And because when you're unfulfilled in your lowest values, you activate the amygdala and you go into immediate gratification. And immediate gratification interferes with long-term contribution, long-term momentum building achievements. You won't build a brand with immediate gratification. You build a brand by long-term vision and contribution and integrity, integration. And the higher you go in the brain, the more integration you have. And the lower you go in the brain, the more disintegration. And the compulsive, immediate gratifying, impulsive Addictive behaviors are the byproduct of an unfulfilled life. We're trying to get an immediate fix to compensate for the unfulfillment. So finding out what's truly most important, which is why I have on my website the value determination process, to try to give people an opportunity to capture what that is. Because if you get that, you don't need motivation. I don't need motivation to do what I'm doing. It's 1 a.m. here, as you know, and I got another thing at 7. So, and I just did another thing at 9. I don't need motivation to do what I love doing, but I would need motivation to do things that are lower. But I learned if I delegate everything that I require motivation to, I've got an inspired life. So I surround myself with people that love doing what I want to delegate, so I don't have to do low priority things.
Yeah, no, and I think it's so important. And let's talk about that. So let's talk about love. And as you say, when people are using language like I have to, or I need to, or I ought to, or I should, it's an indication they're living someone else's values that have been injected or projected onto them, and they're lower. When you're using language like I love to, I choose to, then people are inspired. They're indicators of that potentially being the case. What's love?
Well, people ask me it all the time, and when I give them the answer, they go, what? I call love is the synthesis and synchronicity of all perceived complementary opposites. And I'm going to say it again because people go, what? I don't understand that. It's the synthesis and synchronicity of all complementary opposites, all perceptible complementary opposites. So what does that mean? That means that when you are in a relationship with somebody, they're going to support you at times. They're going to challenge you at times. If they supported you and you perceive them more supporting than challenging, you'd be infatuated with them. If you see more challenging and supporting, you'd be resentful to them. You want to hug them and slug them. But if you see them as both and they're synchronous, you feel poised and present and you feel love. Now, in every moment of our life, whatever we perceive, we have two ways of perceiving it. From a subjective bias perspective, where we see one side and we're unconscious of another side, or a simultaneous contrast, an objective view, where we see both sides simultaneous. If we are infatuated, we're conscious of the upsides and unconscious of the downsides. If we're resentful, we're conscious of the downsides, unconscious of the upsides. If we're in love, we see both sides and embrace both sides equally, simultaneously. And the way I know that is because after doing the Breakthrough Experience program, which is one of my signature programs, 1,143 times, and taking people through a process, which I call the Demartini method, to help people obtain that state, tears of gratitude and open-hearted love is what they express, regardless of any culture I've been in. It's always expressed that way. And many people use a superficial love when they're infatuated. Oh, I love you, and now I hate you. And they've got this polarity, and they think that love is an infatuation. And when it's support, then you love me. If you challenge me, you don't love me. It's the support and challenge. And if you're not able to embrace both of those simultaneously, you're going to be in a bipolar position all the time, looking for love in all the wrong places. The Buddha said the desire for that which is unobtainable, the infatuated side, and the desire to avoid that which is unavoidable, the resentment side, is a source of human suffering. But when you actually see both sides and embrace both sides of the magnet of life, you can now have an objective view of life. You can now have mindfulness because you're fully conscious of both sides. Wilhelm Wundt, the psychologist, in about 1895 said that there are simultaneous contrasts and sequential contrasts. Sequential contrast is when you infatuate, and then weeks later, now you resent, and then weeks later, you like them again, and you dislike them again, and it's vacillating, and you're unstable, and you're emotional, and you're in systems one thinking where you're emotional before you're thinking. And systems two is when you're thinking before you're emotional, but you actually can see objectively both sides, and you're now fully conscious of both sides simultaneously. And Wilhelm Wundt said that's a self-actualized state. Maslow called it self-actualization. It's called equanimity. It's called superconsciousness by Book. There are hundreds of writers through the ages that have referred to this. It was called the synthesis of the dialectic by Hegel and Zeno, and even Plato. So they all understood this. It was called enlightenment, moksha, and liberation, and satori. It was given different names through the ages by theologians and philosophers and mystics. But it's about the synthesis and synchronicity of any possible complementary opposite. It's called the mysterium conjunctivum by Jung. It's called the Gestalt equanimity of the Gestalt. There's many names for it, but it's a synthesis and synchronicity of complementary opposites. That's what love really means. The pairs of opposites joined together, embraced simultaneously in full awareness.
And that last piece there, in full awareness, so we go through stuff in life, stuff happens. Some people use another word that begins with S, but stuff happens. And one of the greatest abilities that we possess that most don't know how to use is the ability to see the blessing in a crisis and be able to take a perspective that enables us to bring us to that point where we consciously become aware of the synchronicities. So
yes,
but for people that aren't familiar with that, and there's one of your quotes that I'm going to quote. I'm wrong here, I'm sure, but to paraphrase, it's to do with the masses and the masters. The masters.
Well, the masses live in the illusion of gain and loss. The master lives in a world of transformation.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was about to say.
Yes. Whenever we're perceiving a loss, it's only because we were infatuated with its form. We only perceive the loss of that which we infatuate with. We only perceive the gain of that which we resent as distressful. There's only two forms of distress in life: the perception of loss of that which you seek, perception of gain of that which you try to avoid. When you realize that as long as you're polarized and you're seeking with an infatuation and impulse towards in the amygdala and avoiding with an instinct away in the amygdala, you're living in the illusions of gain and loss, the fear of loss of that which you look for and the fear of gain of that which you're trying to avoid, and you're living in the illusions of gain and loss. When you realize things objectively, that you can't get one-sided events, and you're able to see both simultaneously, and you're completely untouched, as the Buddha would say, untouched by those attachments. Because anything that you infatuate with will occupy space and time in your mind and run your mind. Anything that you resent will occupy space and time in your mind and run your mind. But when you transcend that and see the synthesis of both, and you're neutral, you don't fear the loss of things, you don't fear the gain of things. You adapt in the dance of life instead of being a victim of the circumstance of life.
So in a contextual example of that, so let's take business, for example, and someone's got distress because they're doing things that they kind of know they shouldn't be doing because they're not their highest values. At what point is it a case of saying, right, well, actually, I just need to delegate that out and have someone else take care of that for me because it's not high my values, versus seeing the rather than looking at a perspective to see that doing the thing would be in alignment with their values. So, for example, so hopefully that makes sense. But I'm going to use you as an example. So, I don't know how many decades it's been that you've not driven for, you've not cooked for, but I know it's a significant number. But then there's writing and teaching that are high on your values. I'm sure there would be a way that you could, if you went through and did a benefit stack of seeing how cooking and driving would be aligned with your values, but you still choose to delegate it. So at what point do you decide what you shift your perspective on and what you actually just delegate out, if that makes sense?
Yeah, very simple. At age 27, you may remember I found a book called The Time Trap by Alan McKenzie. And then when I read this book, I summarized it like I do many books. And I created a 6-column chart. And in the first column, I wrote down everything I did in a day. And not just today, but every day I could think of for about a 3-month period. What do I do? How do I spend my time? I want to be like a hovering, drone looking over me and looking at my life honestly. What do I actually spend my day doing? Not what I fantasize I'm doing, not what I want to lie about what I'm doing, but what am I actually doing? And I wrote it all out as objectively as I could, because I felt that if you're not integral with yourself and honest to yourself, you're probably already starting off on a wrong foot, with a shoe that's backwards or something. After I made that list, while I was doing it, I was realizing that I'm spending a lot of time doing low party stuff. I was majoring in minors and minoring in majors. And I could inwardly, intuitively sense that as I was writing it and thinking, I got nobody to look at here except me, why I'm manifesting my life the way I am. When I got through that list, I couldn't think of anything more. I got everything down. I then went down the second column of the 6 columns. How much does it produce per hour? Because productivity meant that I'm doing something that's meaningful, that serves somebody and their values, and a contribution, which is what my motor actions are for, to make a contribution to make some difference and be of service to people. And I was measuring the service by what it was generating. If I'm generating more, it's serving more. If I'm not generating more, it's not serving more. So I looked at what I was doing and what it was generating per hour. And that was extremely eye-opening, because that was really obvious that there was really a handful of things that were actually producing, and there's a whole lot of things that wasn't making me money and costing. And some were 0, 0, 0, 0. And I thought, well, that's ridiculous. I'm devaluing myself. Every time I'm doing that, I'm devaluing my time. I'm diluting my potential for time. And then I looked and I found out that me going out and speaking in front of a group of people and generating clients was the most leveraged and productive thing I could be doing. The second most was my clinical application of working with people, but that was still finite and limited compared to the leveraging factor. So I then went through and reprioritized that entire list on what produced the most per hour down to least per hour. And I even made some adjustments, said I'm starting to charge for that because that's friggin' a lot of my time. And I started charging and valuing myself. So I got the benefit of valuing myself on some things and raising values on some of those things that were 0. Then I went to the third column after prioritizing that. And I looked at what exactly is the meaning to it. On a 1 to 10 scale, is it something intrinsically driving that I'm inspired, I can't wait to do, I just dream about it? And is it verse down at the bottom, which is a 1 or a 0, where I feel like I got to do it? And it's an extrinsic driven thing where I need motivation to do it. And I keep procrastinating on it, hesitating on it, and letting it stack up until it's got to be done. And I prioritize that list again. And when I got through that prioritized list, I happened to notice that some of the most meaningful things were also the things most productive. And I thought, if I'm going to concentrate on things that are most meaningful and most productive, I'm now going to be most inspired to be of greatest service and generate the most income. So that was a major insight there. Then I went to the next column. What would it cost to hire somebody and delegate that to somebody? How much would it cost to do that? And that's at the same standard of me doing it. Because sometimes we block our delegations by thinking, well, I could have done it. By the time I've done it, give it to them, I could have done it. Or the way I do it is better than them. And I come up with all these bullshit excuses. And I went through and looked at what would it actually cost me to get somebody that I could free it up, that is more knowledgeable, more inspired, more capable of doing that action than me. So I don't have to ever think about it again. And I put the dollar value, and I don't mean their salary. I mean their paperclip costs, their computer costs, their training costs, their space usage costs, their insurance, their bonuses, their training, everything, their plant repair, plant maintenance, everything was about the cost of that place. And I wrote all that down. Then I looked at the spread. Where was the biggest spread between what I do and what it produces versus what it costs to delegate it? To look at the spreads, and I prioritized that according to spread. The next one was about how much time was I averaging per day. Taking over a 3-month period, I might only do it once a month. Okay, an hour once a month is per day is 10 seconds or something. And I looked at exactly how much is the actual usage of that time. So I could then structure job descriptions accordingly. And the final is the reprioritization, factoring all the variables to look at what is really the most important, most meaningful and productive and financially remunerating as it can. Because if you're not rewarding yourself for what you're doing, you'll burn out. You'll get frustrated in your job. When I did, I then layered that into 10 layers. And I hired job description, hired that person to do that, and then that, and then that. And from age 27, when I read that book, it's October, age 27, 1982, 18 months later, the spring, like March, not even March of 2000 and the following year, 2004, I think it was by then, I had freed all that up, was delegating everything off my plate. I had 5 doctors, 12 staff members, and my 5,000 square foot office, and I was making tenfold net income after all that was done. And now I'm only teaching and clinically applying it to the highest priority clients. Everything else is delegated and trained. I never turned back. So I never did a financial management, reconciliation, bank stuff, investment stuff. I never did. I just automated everything and delegated everything. And most of it was automated, so I didn't even require a human being. It was just electronically done. I was using electronics and automation prior to when a lot of people were doing that. And I never went back. So I don't do anything today except teach, research, write as I travel. That's it.
Love that. Thank you so much.
Oh, by the way, to answer your question, I didn't really answer it. Well, I didn't really answer it. So if I have something, which I don't today, but if I had something that I thought that I haven't got somebody to delegate that to yet, instead of being drained, frustrated doing it, I asked how specifically is doing this temporarily until I can delegate that, helping me fulfill my mission. And I would stack that up. But I knew I was going to delegate it because it wasn't producing the amount.
Yeah.
So I would eventually delegate it, but I will then love it. I always say, go do what you love through delegating or love what you do through linking. And then you link it temporarily until you can delegate. But once you delegate, it's off your plate.
And that's the key word, the temporarily. So it's not then doing such a big benefit stack that you think you're going to be doing this thing for the rest of your life. It's just to, as I understand it, to create an element of peace and harmony whilst the next evolution,
Yes.
which is the delegations coming.
Well, I have Michelin rated cooks now. I've got a captain. I've got concierge. I've got private jet guy. I got private, limo guy. Everything that I need is a specialist that does whatever I need, whenever I need it. I'd much rather live in that zone than have to do all that stuff that I'm not engaged in. I was at the pool yesterday, or day before yesterday. Forget what day it is. Day before yesterday, I was sitting at the pool with a lovely lady who's a very fortunate lady, and she was sitting there doing some sort of bank reconciliation and was frustrating herself looking at numbers. I said, just out of curiosity, why are you doing that? And she said, because I got to do it. I said, you got to do it? You're worth $100 million and you're sitting there and doing a bank reconciliation? That's a $50 an hour job. Why are you doing that? She just looked at me and she goes, I don't trust people. And I said, so the amount of distrust you have for somebody for doing something because you had a bad experience. It's like you had go to a barber shop and you had a bad haircut. Does that mean I'm never going to trust haircutters again? What does that mean? Well, no, I'm going to get a haircut again. I said, well, so let's find you another person to do that so you can be freed, because you're worth way more than the time spent doing that type of thing. And she goes, it aggravates the crap out of me. It makes me wonder what I'm doing, why this happened. I'm calling these people. And I said, let it go. I said, well, what if there's somebody that messes it up? Put automation and controls in place so they can't. And then free yourself up, because whatever they do, it's too insignificant compared to the stress it's putting you under. And she looked at me and she says, I can't believe I didn't see the obvious. This is a very wealthy lady, very fortunate lady, has no problem economically. It's just she was not delegating something that she felt she had to go. She wouldn't let it go. And I assure you that there's a lot of people holding on to things that if they freed it up, they'd have way more energy to go and do something they're really inspired to do. And they'll produce more and build more of a brand than be caught in the quagmire of a desperate life. Anytime you're doing low priority things, you devalue yourself. Anytime you do the highest priority thing, you're valuing yourself. And so does the world.
Very true indeed. Very true indeed. So like I said, I mean, for people that are watching this on YouTube, I mean, this is just a small selection of some of the books that Dr. John Demartini's written. I mean, how many books in total is it that you've, and there's like, what, 6 there?
I don't know. We just signed a 20 book deal. So I've got 20 books coming out. We got 2 coming out from one company, another 2 coming from another company, just this with the probably next 12 months. So we got 20 more books that'll be hitting the market.
On top of how many already?
If we look at just self-help books, about 40. But if we look at all the manuscripts, it's in the hundreds.
Wow.
Put all the manuscripts together.
And I've spent hours, like hundreds and hundreds of hours, learning with you in person, spending one-on-one time with you, group sessions, audios, all these programs. And one of the most recent programs that I did was one that I found personally fascinating, and I was scribbling away in my journal with all of the notes. And it was about the philosophical, get the word right, the philosophical questioning of the essence of the soul. Now, 10 minutes ago, we were speaking about what love is. And I know you've also got your own definition of what the soul is too. For people that aren't familiar with that, what's that?
That's a great question. I use an acronym. The soul is the state of unconditional love. And it's not something that is daily, moment by moment for most people, but it's a moment where we actually are authentic. So let's say that we perceive somebody that we look down on and we exaggerate ourselves and puff ourselves up and are too proud to admit what we see in them inside us and look down on them, and we exaggerate ourselves. And we go into a persona that's inauthentic by an exaggerated persona, a pride persona. That's not us. That's a self-righteous, disowned person. Which means we're disowning what we see in them, and we don't realize, we don't have reflective awareness. There's no complete reflective awareness. There's a deflective perception. Or we might look up to somebody we admire. I worked with a celebrity yesterday that was admiring another celebrity and minimizing themselves in comparison to him. And then we end up minimizing ourselves, and we go into a kind of a shame and a self-depreciation state. And that's not authentic self. So when we minimize ourselves or exaggerate ourselves, we're not being ourselves. But if all of a sudden we realize with reflective awareness that whatever we see in others, we have within ourselves, we're not too proud or too humble to admit what we see in others we have in ourselves. We have reflective awareness. That's intimacy. That means that I have within me everything I see in them. And it is not disconnected. When there's a deflection and a disowned part, you don't have intimacy. You have a judgment. As Empedocles said, there's love and strife, and that's strife because you're superior or inferior and you're exaggerating or minimizing and inauthentic, and it's an imposter syndrome. And when we do, we end up going into narcissism when we do, and we try to get something for nothing. We want them to live in our values. And we go down, we tend to go into altruism. We want to sacrifice ourselves for others and try to live in their values. And when we equilibrate that, we try to communicate our values in terms of other people's values, which is what creates sustainable fair exchange and true caring. When we look down, we're careless. We look up, we're careful. If we look across, we're caring, which keeps the rings on the finger. In that state of caringness, when we actually feel intimate and we realize that what I'm looking at is me, the seer, the seeing, and the seen are the same. For just a moment, as Schopenhauer says, we become our true self to the degree that we make everyone else ourselves. And we have a love for humanity. That's philosophia, but it's also philanthropia. It's basically a mixture of us loving ourselves and loving human beings. In that state, we have a state of unconditional love. We're authentic and we're inspired, and our heart opens and we're grateful, and we're now transcendent to the judgments, and we're in a transcendent mind state, as Immanuel Kant would say. And we're now in a place where we're authentic, and that's integrity, because we've integrated our two sides, the exaggerated and minimized stuff, the pride and self-righteous side, and the shamed and self-righteous side, the superior complex, the inferior complex. We've integrated into the essence of our true being. This is the superconscious, spiritual conscious, mindful state, satori, moksha. We're liberated from our judgments because the things we look above and below at occupy our minds. We're now liberated from the noise in the brain. We're now in a spontaneous, inspired grace state. This is the soul. And this is the state that is obtainable, not sustainable. We don't sustain it every day, all day long, because we're here to learn our next illusion. But we can have a moment of it and have a moment of grace. Because what's interesting is when we're looking down on somebody and we see somebody challenging us, our sympathetic response comes in, and that activates our extensors, our external rotators, our supinators, our abductors. And if we are looking up at somebody and minimizing, our parasympathetic comes on, then activates our flexors and our internal rotators and our pronators and our adductors. And our physiology and our muscles are graceful when we see both sides. When we actually see both sides of people and don't put them on pedestals or pits, and don't put ourselves in pits or pedestals, we have literally fluent agonist and antagonist muscular activity, which is called graceful movement. And that's an experience of grace. So we literally have, when we have no desire to change others relative to us or us relative to others, when there's nothing to change, we're in a state of thank you, true grace. Our body is in a graceful movement. We're not erratically with internal content, strife inside. we have a poised state, and we are in a state of grace where our human will now matches what is. As the Gita says, Om Tat Sat, as it is. We're now in a state where we're now appreciating life as it is, instead of how it needs to be fixed, holding on to a fantasy how it needs to be changed, us or others. And that's where we actually have the soul, the state of unconditional love for life and for ourselves and for the people around us. There's it's a moment of judgelessness, mindfulness. Because anything we're infatuated or resentful to, that we're too proud or too humble to admit, these are disowned parts. That's a void that leaves us empty. That's why we will never feel fulfilled judging. We'll feel fulfilled when we actually have that state of authenticity. And I think that the physiology is guiding us with physiological symptoms, psychological symptoms, sociological feedback, all to get us back to authenticity so we can maximize our potential and fulfillment in our own lives.
And that what that final part there that you've just said. So for everyone that's just listening, by the way, you can see why out of the hundreds and hundreds of hours I've spent learning from Dr. Demartini, in that brief couple of minutes, you can see why this is such already become one of my favorite topics and learnings and lessons that I've taken. I think it was like a 5-hour webinar, 5-hour training that you did back in December. But it was that piece that you said there in terms of having the ability to get into that state, and you say it's not, you're not in it every day, but you have the ability to get into it. So when people have this perception, because it certainly was my perception for many years, is that we have sort of mind, body, and spirit being, as many other people thought it would be like the soul. So it's like we have these meat suits, if you like, that we're in, and then the soul sort of enters the body. But in the way that you describe it, it's the soul is using the indicators of the body, so the feedback mechanisms being sort of emotions and feelings, if you like, to guide us to have a perspective of being in gratitude and being in a equanimity. But do you believe that we have, because people talk about past lives and previous lives and these being an old soul, so do you still believe that this a soul, a spirit comes into the body and lives in that way? I'm interested in your thoughts.
Well, this has been questioned. You got to go back to even before Aristotle and Plato, and go back even to Pythagoras and before, into the ancient Egyptians and Sumerians. They had different ideas. It wasn't hard for earliest human beings to see that at the point of the first breath, there was beginning of life, animation. The baby took in a breath, it's alive, and the last breath, it's dead. There's no more breathing. So it wasn't hard to see that. So spirit means breath, inspiration, expiration, life, death. That was the beginning point of the idea of a soul, or spirit, if you will. And when those are, and by the way, inspiration is associated with sympathetic and expiration associated with parasympathetic. If you study, the way the physiology works, the autonomic nervous system, and heart rate variabilities occur. One speeds up heart rate, one slows it down, one increases lung function, one decreases it. So there is a very physiological mechanism of where this idea came from on the idea of spirit or soul. Because they saw it coming in, inhalation, and going out. So they perceived it somehow going in and out of the body. And then we asked, what exactly is coming in? Well, okay, oxygen, but there's more than just oxygen. There's positive and negatively charged atomic and subatomic elements that are being taken in and out. And this deals with positive and negative polarities. The mystics of the East called it prana, which was a term for another term that was called fohad or caloric, or it had many names through the ages. I went through and found hundreds of names going back thousands of years of this same element. It was called, ether at one time. But it's basically the electromagnetic field that we breathe in the positive and negative charged particles that we breathe. And we literally breathe in positive and negative charged particles. And so this breath is bringing in oxygen, but it's bringing out CO2, but it's also bringing in these particles of light. Light divides itself into positrons, electrons, and we're breathing in positrons, electrons constantly. So this was the thing. And we find out that turbinates in our nose are like ionizers, and they basically are involved in these polarities. So we are taking things in, but this is always present. So I don't want to come up the idea that the soul comes into the body and leaves the body. It's like a radio station. The radio station, if you drop your phone in, it gets run over by a car and you got to go get another phone. The radio station didn't disappear. The station's there, but the receiver is now destroyed. So if your body's not functioning and can't receive it, it dies. If it's able to receive it and breathe and everything else, it's alive. So I like to think of the essence of the soul is always present, but we have our body to be able to access it. And if our body breaks down, we no longer access it. So I like to think of that as an analogy better than anything else. But there's also now knowledge in the quantum world. There was been a debate between Susskind, Hawking. It started with them, Susskind and Hawking. These are astrophysicists. You remember Stephen Hawking, probably most people would remember him, but Susskind is maybe less known, but he's just as significant. Their debate on what happens to information in the universe. In 1993, the July edition in Scientific American, there was a great little piece that Freeman Dyson, who's an astrophysicist from, at the time, Princeton, Advanced Studies of Princeton, talked about the idea that if the universe, it was to dissipate into a heat death at the end of the universe, what would happen to all the information in consciousness? He said it would be stored in charged particles of light. And so when I read that, I immediately contacted this guy and went to Princeton and had a conversation with him for quite a few hours on what exactly does that mean. And we had a discussion about what is called the unitarity principle. And in the quantum world, there's a conservation of information. There's no loss of information, just like conservation of energy, baryons, leptons, linear momentum, angular momentum. There's conservation law. Information is conserved. In the general theory of relativity, in a black hole, information is supposed to be lost. But Susskind argued and won the argument with Hawking that no, it's not lost. And he came up with explanations of where the information in the universe, when a star eventually gets dissolved at the end of its life, what happens to all the information that was on that solar system, like us and the planet? And he believed it was stored in charged particles of light and recycled back out into the universe to give life again. So if we come from that perspective, we look at all the elements that make up our body based on density, they're recycled back to the earth or they're recycled into the gases. It's possible that the information, because in Claude Shannon's work on information theory, he believed that all qubits and all bits of information of zeros and ones could be described as the conscious and unconscious portions of the positive and negative charges and the spins of these atoms and electrons. So it's very possible that the knowledge that we have is stored in charged particles of light, and that is not lost, it's continued. But it's not like the storybooks and the eschatological studies of some of the theological constructs of the institutions we have of religion, but it may be there in the field and never lost and may be picked up in others. In the Breakthrough Experience program, when people go through the grief process and death process, I have them account for everything that they think is missing in somebody who took it on. And we can account for every one of the behavioral traits. Somebody's picked it up and somebody else has passed. So it's there transiently in one or many people in a form of kind of reincarnating into another form. The knowledge is not lost. The behavior is not lost. So I'm a firm believer that it's conserved, and it could be literally into a field. It could be put into particles, or it could be put back into human experiences. So I don't want to say that it's like the storybook original idea that it's this little entity that goes out and disappears and goes into this place and comes back. I like to think of it as it's a field of energy that's there, showing up as waves and particles. It's information. We have access to it. And if you came to the Breakthrough Experience and watch people who access that and gain knowledge that you don't even know how they gain that information, you tend to have an idea that there's a continuance and there's a unitarity and there's a conservation of information and there's not lost. But I don't want to put it into the old version that was 2,000 years old as much as that. I think that's a limited version compared to the knowledge we have today on what could actually be demonstrating this intelligence.
Thank you for sharing that. And on that note, just really quickly, so Dr. Demartini runs lots of different programs, but his breakthrough program is one of it's sort of I suppose the basis of lots of the other work that come up, and it's a truly life-changing experience. I've done it many times myself. I'm going to put a link in the show notes for anyone that's listening to be able to get on and book out or find out at very least more about that program and the benefit of it. So we'll link that in there for people to go and get access to. And what I'm also going to do, I don't want to sort of go into it right now because a few other questions I've got, but I'm going to put a link, which is a free process for you to do, which is the Demartini values determination process. It's one of the best ways in the world of finding what your values are. A lot of people think about values, and Dr. Demartini will explain this more, of values as social idealisms, but truly knowing what your values are, what I personally refer to as means values. And then you can go through that process free to do, and it's extremely insightful. And I'll put the link in the show notes for that, guys. So go and do that for sure. Do that for sure. I remember, so I have what I call crazy ideas. And a lot of my crazy ideas come from when I'm by running water. So sometimes in the shower, sometimes if I'm out running by a river. And I've looked into this, and I sort of studied it. I tried to look for the science in it, and to negative ions and things like that. And I remember about 3 years ago or 4 years ago, we were sitting down having lunch, and I shared one of my crazy ideas. And one of my crazy ideas that I had when I was in the shower, I might have been out running, was that light is knowledge. And I've just written my book, which I'm hoping at some point you're going to be running the forward to, but we'll speak about that separately. Was that light was knowledge. And I remember sharing my idea with you, and then separately, a friend of mine who I also met when I was doing the breakthrough, funnily enough, which is Michael Hode, who's a film director, said to me about, well, this crazy idea of yours, I don't think it's that crazy. Have you heard of, and let me grab the book, The Secret of Light by Walter Russell. And I remember reading this book and just being, oh my God, wow, where has this crazy idea, as I called it, the crazy idea, come from? And there was all of this information that sort of Walter Russell had documented, sort of much of what you've just spoken about, which was pretty mind-blowing at the time. So,
I'd like to add to that. In physics, there are two types of statistical evaluations of particles in the universe. And they fall under what they call Fermi-Dirac statistics, or Bose-Einstein statistics. And these are basically probabilistic behaviors of particles. And the ones that are for Fermi-Dirac are matter particles. And these are things like leptons and quarks, and they are like electrons and protons, hadrons. And then there is another one called bosons. So one is fermions and one is bosons. And these are the Einstein-Bose statistics. And these are force particles, light. Now, what's interesting is light can convert, according to Einstein's equation, light can convert into particles and antiparticles. Paul Dirac, in his work on Nobel Prize in 1947, wrote the Principles of Quantum Mechanics and introduced the idea of for every particle, there's an antiparticle. So E equals mc squared is really E equals a plus and minus mc squared, and the m is actually a particle and antiparticle mass that can counter each other and convert back into a massless state called a photon. So what's interesting is you can convert energy into matter and matter to energy, and energy is spaceless, timeless, massless, and chargeless, which follows Bose statistics. And fermions, matter, is spaceful, timeful, massful, chargeful. So one's an unconditional state, one's a conditional state. One's like spirit, one's like matter of the ancients. Spirit without matter is expressionless, matter without spirit is motionless. It's an old statement that goes back hermetically. But then there's an intermediate state called virtual particles. And there's virtual photons and there's virtual particles, which are intermediate transitions for one and the other as they convert back and forth. And out of the uncertainty principle that Heisenberg conceded, which is just a probability mathematics, not a fact, but a probability mathematics, out of the quantum vacuum in every place in the universe at 1 × 10⁻³ centimeters in space, in these little cubical little units, the uncertainty principle is emerging and submerging from unconditional to conditional and back and forth. It's very possible that consciousness is not the photon, it's not the positron electron, it's the virtual particles going into an unconditional state or conditional state, vacillating back and forth as consciousness is identifying with a subjective experience or an objective presence. So the light is the key to storing it in that form, but particles also store it in the other form. So we know in computer science today, we can store bits of information in positive and negatively charged parts of crystalline, semiconductors. We can also convert it into light because we can transfer information all across there. But right in between those is where consciousness is. And some believe, as panpsychists believe, that out of the emergence of consciousness, all these forces and source particles, these bosons and fermions, these light and matter particles exist out of consciousness. So this is something that is an emergent function that's even more fundamental than the things we see with our perceptions.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Fascinating. Thank you so much, Dr. Demartini. So for everyone that's been listening, this is just a very small glimpse of the love and the wisdom that Dr. Demartini has and that he's been sharing with us today. As I've already mentioned, I highly recommend check out go and determine your values, go and do that process. It's free to do. Head to the website and go and do that. Secondly, definitely explore the breakthrough experience. And like I said, we'll put a link to the show notes there for you to go and explore that. And if you haven't already, definitely go and connect with Dr. Demartini on the social pages, the Facebooks and the Instagrams, to be able to absorb more information. And finally, there is actually another episode, if you're interested, on the Make It Happen with Will Polston podcast. There is another episode that we did, which was called Cultivating an Attitude of Gratitude, where we spoke about the power of gratitude from a few years back, that you can go back and have a listen to. So go and check that out. So Dr. Demartini, thank you again for your time. It's been wonderful catching up and sharing your wisdom today. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me on your show. Thank you for the questions, and I appreciate what you're doing. Thank you.
Everyone else, until next time, make it happen.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Make It Happen with Will Polston podcast. Make sure you join Will's free Facebook group, the Make It Happen community. Please support the show by subscribing on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or Google Play. Share this episode with at least one friend you think would benefit from it, and give Will a 5-star review wherever you download your podcasts. Until next time, make it happen.